Okay, today we are very happy to have Professor Jonathan Katz to be here to give us a talk about blockchain. So let me have a brief introduction of Professor Katz. So Professor Katz is a professor of computer science at the University of Maryland College Park, and he is also the director of the Maryland Cybersecurity Initiative there. And he has co-authored a textbook, Intro to Modern Cryptography, which is now in the second edition, and also another monograph on digital signature. And by the way, my course is also using these two books. And he is a program co-chair of Annual Crypto Conference and the ACM Conference on Computers, Communication and Security. So without further ado, let's have a quick welcome to Professor Katz.
Great, thanks so much. I'm very happy to be here. Actually, it's my first time in Hong Kong, so it's great to get a chance to visit the city. I'm excited to talk to you today about some work on a new blockchain proposal, a high-performance proof-of-stake blockchain. And just by way of outline, I don't actually know what kind of background most people in the audience have. I'm going to start with just a very, very high-level discussion of what you need to know about proof-of-work blockchains, with Bitcoin being the primary example, although there have been others that have been developed since then. And what I really want to get across there is just basically the high-level idea of how it works, and then talk a little bit about some of the drawbacks of these existing proof-of-work systems. And actually, I'll just mention that it's really only going to be about 2 slides or so talking about Bitcoin, but if you're interested in hearing more about it and learning more about the protocol, there's going to be a tutorial tomorrow and Friday, and I'm giving an introduction to Bitcoin and blockchain tomorrow morning here in Hong Kong, so you can come to that and learn more about more details about Bitcoin. Then I'm going to talk about 2 pieces of work that combine to give us the results that I mentioned in the intro. So basically, we have a novel proof-of-stake blockchain called iChain. It's basically using a different sort of mechanism for achieving consensus as compared to Bitcoin and as compared to the kind of blockchains you may be familiar with. And in particular, what it uses is what's called a proof-of-stake type of mechanism for consensus rather than a proof-of-work. So I'll talk a little bit about what proof-of-stake is at a high level. I'll talk a little bit about the details of how we implement proof-of-stake in our system. I'll talk also about some existing proposals for other proof-of-stake blockchains and highlight where we differ and what our improvements are compared to those. And then I'll give a high-level overview of our particular protocol. Then I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go down a level, if you think about it, going down a level in the network stack, and talk about some work we have giving a new high-performance network layer mechanism for improving throughput and latency in blockchain systems in general. So actually, you can apply these ideas, we believe, to multiple systems. You can apply it in particular to our blockchain protocol, iChain, but you can apply it to other protocols as well, including Bitcoin, although you'd have to modify the protocol somewhat. But it's a general technique for improving blockchain performance and really almost reaching the physical limits given by the network over which the protocol is running. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean there by the limits and what I mean by the optimal performance that exactly we're claiming. Then I'll just conclude with some brief mention of experiments and benchmarks that we've done on our protocol on both of these systems and compare it to prior work as well. And you can feel free to stop me at any time with questions. I'll also pause in the middle after I talk about the iChain protocol right about here in the talk. I'll stop and I'll see if there are any questions, but you can feel free to stop me at any time. That's totally fine. Just at a high level, though, I want to kind of give the takeaway point of this talk, is that when you combine the 2 mechanisms I just mentioned on the previous slide, what we believe we have is an improvement to existing blockchain systems along 3 different axes. And we're working on more, but actually it's hard to represent once we go to 4 or more. But at least 3 different axes of performance improvement. Number 1, our system is more sustainable. Right? This is very important. You may have heard actually one of the fundamental drawbacks of Bitcoin that I'll talk about more in a few slides is that it's wasting or at least using a huge amount of electricity. And in contrast to that, proof-of-stake mechanisms for blockchains are much more energy efficient and have extremely low energy consumption. So from that point of view, any proof-of-stake system is going to be more sustainable than a proof-of-work type system. Combining our 2 techniques, we get increased scalability. As I said on the previous slide, we're getting near optimal performance at the network layer. and near optimal throughput and latency for the overall confirmation time in the blockchain itself. And arguably, our system is more secure than alternatives. So in a technical sense, right, we achieve similar thresholds against adversary behavior as in existing systems. However, there are some fundamental reasons to argue that proof-of-stake systems are in general more secure in the real world as compared to proof-of-work systems, in part because proof-of-stake systems arguably foster increased decentralization. So this basically is making it more difficult for an attacker to control a significant fraction of the network. And also, in case an attacker does end up controlling a very large fraction of the network, in a proof-of-stake system, they're actually disincentivized then from attacking the system. And in addition, the fact that we are able to achieve better use of network resources means that we can lower the required network resources for parties to participate in the system. This again will increase the number of people participating, leading to increased decentralization, making it more difficult for an attacker to take over a large fraction of the network. So this is what I mean when I claim that we're more secure than other schemes. So as promised, I'll begin just with a very, very brief, extremely high-level introduction to Bitcoin. Actually, can I get a show of hands? How many people are familiar with the Bitcoin protocol? So not very many, maybe a third or less of the audience. Okay, so that's fine. People who are familiar, you'll see it's a really very, very high-level overview. People who are not, I hope this gives you enough of a sense of what's going on that you can follow the remainder of the talk. At a very high level, the Bitcoin cryptocurrency is built atop a blockchain, where a blockchain provides a mechanism for achieving consensus in a distributed system. Right? The problem of consensus has been studied for years, for decades, in the distributed systems community. Blockchain is ultimately just another name for a task that has been considered for those many years. In particular, the protocol used by Bitcoin is called Nakamoto consensus, after Nakamoto, the person who put out the white paper proposing Bitcoin. And the basic idea is that you have a number of users who are broadcasting transactions. Doesn't have to be Bitcoin transactions, but in this case, of course, it is. And they're generating and broadcasting these transactions and gossiping them throughout some network of users, as well as what are called miners. The miners, who are the ones maintaining the blockchain, are arranged in a peer-to-peer network. And what they do is they basically maintain a system of blocks. And in Nakamoto consensus, the longest chain here is always considered the current state of the system. Okay, so there may possibly be blocks that are off the main chain. These are called forks. But ultimately, those are going to be discarded and rejected by the system. And as I said, the state of the system is just going to be whatever the longest chain is at any particular point in time. Now, how do you build on this chain? You build on this chain using what's called a proof of work. So essentially what happens is that all these miners are continually trying to solve some cryptographic puzzle. And the particular cryptographic puzzle that they use in Bitcoin has the following form. What you do is you compute some hash function over some inputs that include a context, which for the purposes of this slide you can think of it as just a pointer back to the previous block, a payload, which in the context of Bitcoin is just a set of transactions that are being included in the current block, and then a nonce, which is just a random value that a miner will continually keep on choosing until they compute a hash value which is less than some threshold t. So this is set so that the number of times on average that the system has to compute these hashes until a valid solution is found is about 10 minutes. Okay, so that means that for any one particular miner, or even more so for any one particular hash computation, the probability of being lower than this threshold is very, very small. But nevertheless, by repeatedly computing these hashes, and by having everybody in the network repeatedly compute these hashes, a solution to this equation is found every 10 minutes. When a miner finds a valid solution, what they can do then is they publish that solution as the next block. Okay, so basically that would extend this chain by one. That everybody can check that it's a valid solution, because verifying that this condition holds just requires a single hash computation. So verifying is much cheaper than finding a solution. And that enables the chain to grow over time. And then I'm not going to talk much about where the guarantees come from, but essentially the consensus guarantee comes from the fact that everybody is always building on the longest chain. So that means that even if you have occasional forks, eventually the tie will be broken, and then eventually everybody in the system will agree on the state of the system because everybody will be in agreement on what the longest chain is. So as I said, that was a very, very high level overview. Now, what are the issues with blockchain, with the Nakamoto Consensus Protocol in particular? So first of all, as I mentioned originally, it's very wasteful. Okay? These proofs of work that all the miners in the system are computing require a lot of computational power, and in particular require a lot of energy consumption. Okay, people are building, as I'm sure you know if you read the news, people are building specialized mining rigs and actually specialized warehouses full of such rigs that are being cooled because of all the electrical activity that they're generating and because of all the heat that's being generated from the computation. The last statistic I saw was that the current electricity consumption in the Bitcoin network as a whole is on par with the electricity consumption of the country of Austria. Okay, that's quite incredible, especially when you think about the fact that the number of miners in the Bitcoin system is probably at least an order of magnitude, if not more, smaller than the population of Austria. So there's a huge amount of energy consumption going on just to maintain consistency in the network. Now, another problem that a lot of people have been worried about with regard to the Bitcoin protocol is the fact that it has very low throughput and very high latency. Right? So throughput is basically the number of transactions that can be confirmed in any time interval, say transactions confirmed per second, and the latency is the amount of time required until any given transaction is confirmed from the time it's pushed into the system. Right? So you can think about the latency as reflecting the amount of time you have to wait when you want to buy something using your Bitcoin until the seller can be guaranteed that the transfer of Bitcoin is confirmed. In Bitcoin, the throughput is approximately 7 transactions per second. In Ethereum, it's the same order of magnitude. And the latency is about 1 hour. Okay, so the time to confirm a transaction is about 1 hour. And you can compare that to what's achieved in modern credit card networks. Right? So a credit card network like Visa's might process 10,000 transactions per second with a latency of only 7 seconds. Right? When you buy something by credit card, it only takes 7 seconds for confirmation to occur, if not less. So our protocol, eChain, tries to mimic the security guarantees of the Bitcoin protocol, but using a proof-of-stake mechanism. And this is going to give us both better sustainability as well as increased security, as I argued earlier. So let me just mention at a high level, what are the differences conceptually between proof-of-work-based blockchain systems and proof-of-stake systems. So as I said a few minutes ago, in a proof-of-work system, the mining, which is being done to extend the blockchain, is based on the hash power of the miners in the network. And what this means, and what you can see even from my brief description that I gave earlier, is that if you look at any one particular miner and assume that they have some delta fraction of the hash power in the Bitcoin network, so say one particular miner has, I don't know, 1,000th of the mining power in the network, then that reflects their probability of being the one to solve the cryptographic puzzle next, and so is equal to the probability that they're going to be the ones to extend the chain. So if I have about 1/1000th of the hash power in the network, I have about that probability of being the next one to extend the chain. Now, in contrast, in a proof-of-stake system, the mining being done to extend the chain is based instead on the amount of stake or the amount of coins that you own. So in that kind of a system, if I own, say, 1,000th of all the coins in the system, then my probability of extending the chain is going to be about 1 in 1,000. Okay, so it's a totally different type of mechanism from a conceptual point of view as compared to a proof-of-work type system. And people have considered proof-of-stake protocols for a number of years, and there are at least a couple of different types of attacks that need to be handled in this setting that, for one reason or another, don't come up in a proof-of-work type blockchain. One of those is a so-called grinding attack, where basically a node in the network will try to extend the chain by varying different parameters. You can think of it as like varying the nonce that I talked about earlier in the context of proof-of-work. The difference is that in the context of proof-of-stake, changing a parameter is going to be very cheap, right? In a proof-of-work-based system, changing a parameter requires you to recompute the hash function that has some computational costs, some energy costs, and so it's not free. But in a proof-of-stake type system, it's essentially free to try to vary parameters and try to increase your probability of extending the chain. Another sort of attack is the so-called nothing-at-stake attack, where again, because of the fact that you can try to extend the blockchain and it doesn't really cost you anything, what you can do is you can try to extend not only the longest chain, but also various forks on the chain. And this might be advantageous, and it's something, so it might be advantageous, and in contrast to a proof-of-work type system, it doesn't really cost you anything to try, so you might as well do it. Another kind of attack is the so-called long-range attack, where basically what a miner can try to do is to fork a chain many blocks backward in the past. And although this is something that you can try to do with a proof-of-work type system, the computational cost of doing that is infeasible, whereas in a proof-of-stake type system, it may actually be possible, depending on how it's designed, to implement such an attack. And so any system you design would have to be resilient, in particular, to these three attacks. Now, there have been some existing proposals for a proof-of-stake system. I'll just highlight some of maybe the better known of those. Algorand, Ouroboros, and Dfinity, for example, which is slightly older protocol than Libra, which is the protocol that Facebook just put out about a month ago, and they've been talking about a lot. Essentially, these are proof-of-stake type systems that rely on Byzantine fault-tolerant like protocols. So Byzantine fault tolerance is basically the kind of consensus protocols that the distributed computing community has been looking at since the 1970s. And those protocols are fine, but the problem with those protocols is that they're either permissioned, meaning that you have to know in advance who's allowed to run the protocol, and you have some central authority who decides whether to admit people or not, and or they're just less decentralized because of the communication complexity of running the protocol is higher than in the Nakamoto consensus-like protocols, and therefore there's inherently more of a limitation on how many parties can participate in the protocol. More recently, there have been some protocols that follow more along the spirit of Bitcoin. Notable examples here are NXT and Snow White. That protocol is fine, although it does have a drawback in that it's not adaptively secure, meaning that an attacker who can choose who to corrupt during the execution of the protocol can actually corrupt people in such a way that it can gain an advantage, which is not possible for an attacker who's limited to corrupting parties statically in advance of the protocol execution. Now, in a real-world execution of a protocol, adaptive corruptions are a real possibility, and therefore this is a potential problem when these protocols are deployed in the real world. Other work, like Ouroboros Praos and Ouroboros Genesis, are, again, proof-of-stake proposals. They are adaptively secure, and they have some, they also basically can be compared to what we're doing. These were all proposed concurrently, and so a more detailed comparison I can mention if there are questions about it, but basically it's concurrent work all going on around the same time. So the way our construction works is, first of all, we have parties register, and when they register with a public key and a private key pair. And in particular, a public-private key pair is going to be associated with one unit of stake. You can think about basically one coin being equivalent to one public key secret key pair. One important distinction between the public key, or between the signature scheme, I should say, that we're using in our protocol and the one used in Bitcoin, is that it's very important for our purposes that the signature scheme being used is what's called a unique signature scheme. So a unique signature scheme has this property that for a given public key and a given message, there's a unique signature that's valid for that message. Right? So this is something that most regular signature schemes do not have. ECDSA does not have that property, which is ECDSA is the signature used by Bitcoin, but it's crucial for our scheme that we use a unique signature scheme. And the proof of stake will then involve solving a puzzle of the following form. So this equation looks very much like what I put up earlier for proof of work. The difference now is that what's going on is that each miner, or I should say for each user in the system and for every unit of stake they hold, namely for every public key that they have, what they'll do is they'll compute a hash function over the context and the payload as before. But now, rather than picking a random nonce and then varying it until they find a solution, what they're going to do is they're just going to try evaluating the hash function on their public key, and then the unique signature on preceding inputs. So the point is that as a miner now, you only have one chance of trying to satisfy this equation. Right? You can't vary this field here because your public key is fixed and there's a unique signature for every context and payload that you have. So the idea is that basically every coin gets one chance to try to solve this puzzle, and in expectation, exactly one of those coins will be will satisfy this equation, and that's the one who's going to be then extending the block in the next round. And otherwise, for now, for this basic system that I'm describing on this slide, you can think about the rest of the protocol being equivalent to what's going on in Bitcoin. Now, if we do this, what we can prove is that this blockchain protocol is secure against a restricted adversary, whereby restricted here, what I mean is that the adversary only tries to extend a single branch, okay, the longest branch, which is what they're supposed to do. And against such an adversary, we can prove the protocol remains secure as long as 51% of the stake in the system is owned by honest parties. That's what I mean by 51% honest here. So this is a good start, right? But the problem is that in general, there's no reason to believe that any real-world adversary would be restricted in that way, right? A real-world adversary would actually potentially try to extend the chain on various forks and not only on the longest branch. And then it's no longer true that we get security as long as 51% are honest. So if the adversary is not restricted, right, then as I said, the attacker can try to extend multiple different branches of the blockchain, and it can do that essentially for free because there's no cost like in a proof-of-work system. And at least in the folklore, when people were thinking about proof-of-stake systems, the concern was that this might allow the attacker to amplify its competitive advantage relative to the honest miners in the system by an arbitrary factor. But in fact, we're able to show that no matter what the attacker does, and even if it tries to extend potentially every block in the system at a given point in time, the amplification ratio of the adversary is bounded by E, right, by the constant E, which is about 2.718. So that's good, right? That means that there's a bound on how well the attacker can do, but it's still not good because it's giving the attacker an advantage over the honest parties. But we can use this insight to actually turn around and design a better protocol. And the idea will be that we'll take the construction as before, but now rather than having the honest parties only try to extend the longest branch, we'll let the honest parties also try to use a more general strategy where they also try to extend other branches, including forks that are not on the longest branch. You could think of this as kind of fighting fire with fire, right? If the adversary is going to do things that they shouldn't be doing, namely trying to extend branches off the longest chain, well, we can let the honest players do that too and define that as part of the protocol. And this actually, as far as we know, is a new way to try to address the nothing at stake attack that I mentioned earlier. And in general, the more complex you make the honest strategies, maybe this is not the best terminology, but basically the more complex the honest strategies are, the lower the amplification ratio will be for the adversary. So it'll be higher for the honest parties, lower for the adversary. And in particular, if you told the honest parties to try to extend every block in the system, then that would be equal to what the most general attacker can do, and there would be no advantage for the attacker at all. On the other hand, we'd like to limit the complexity of the protocol, and so we don't want actually to tell the honest parties to go ahead and mine on every block in the system. But the point is that we can scale up the complexity of the honest strategy and thereby approach the advantage that the attacker has. So the way we deal with this complexity is we define a class of strategies called DF greedy. So D and F are going to be constants, they're parameters here. And of course, the most general strategy that an attacker can follow would be something like the infinity-infinity greedy strategy. But for constants D and F, what is going to be the DF greedy strategy? Well, basically, the strategy will be to try to extend the DF best set of chains. Okay, what does that mean? Well, what it means is we identify the longest chain, right, C best, and say that chain has some length L. Then we'll define the DF best set to be all blocks whose distance to that main chain, to that longest chain, is at most D, and whose length is at least L minus F. So at most F blocks shorter than the longest chain. So a picture is useful here. If we look at what that would give us for the 1-3 greedy strategy, so I'll just flip to this. Imagine we have the current state of the system here. These are all the blocks that have ever been produced. You can see that this central branch here is the longest chain in the system. And all the blocks here are numbered with their distance from the main chain. Right? So the blocks that are on the main chain are labeled with 0. Blocks that are 1 off are labeled with 1. This block is 2 off, so it's labeled with 2. So the 1-3 greedy strategy would tell us that we eliminate from consideration this block right away because it's too far off the main chain. But then in addition, we want to look at all blocks that are whose length is within 3 of the longest chain. Okay? So the only ones then that satisfy both criteria are the ones shaded in blue here. So in the 1-3 greedy strategy, that means that the honest players would then be trying to extend all of those blocks. And just as another example I'll put up quickly, if we look at this, the 2-4 greedy strategy in a slightly more complicated state, right? So again, the longest chain is marked here. All the blocks are labeled with their distance from the main chain. And you can see that only the blocks colored in blue are both within distance 2 of the main chain and also have length no more than 4 less than the length of the main chain. Okay, so we're basically, again, restricting the set of blocks that the honest parties are building on. The attacker can try to build on everything, but we're able this way to bound the competitive advantage of what the attacker can achieve by doing so. And we show in particular that this 2-4 greedy strategy has amplification ratio 2.1. Right? So the attacker can achieve about 2.7, the honest parties are achieving 2.1. So again, we're bringing the honest parties closer to what the adversary is able to achieve. And if you do the calculation, what that gives you is the following in terms of the security thresholds of what the blockchain can handle. If we look at, for example, right, the basic strategy I talked about first, where the honest parties are only building on the main chain, and the adversary we're assuming is also only building on the main chain. So then we only need 51% honest in order to achieve security. But as I said, if we allow a general adversary, then the attacker is able to amplify their stake by about 2.7, and that means that you increase the threshold required for security to about 73%. But if we then tell the honest parties to actually implement the 2-4 greedy strategy, then even if the attacker is able to carry out the most general strategy possible, we need only 57% honest in order for security to hold. Okay, so we're never going to achieve 51% again unless we also have the honest players implement the general strategy, but we can achieve quite close to that and get a security threshold which is quite close to the 51%. I want to mention also about the way we implement joining in the system. This is something that requires some care because there are various attacks that can potentially be carried out by malicious users who, in the course of trying to join the system. We require all parties to register public keys in the system at least k blocks in advance of starting to build on the chain. K is a parameter here. But the basic idea is what we're trying to prevent is if we set k equals 0, meaning that as soon as you register you can build, then that would potentially allow a malicious party to selectively choose a public key, which would immediately allow them to extend the chain. And then of course they could keep on doing that and potentially build on the chain forever with malicious blocks. And so to prevent that, what we have them do is we have them basically, we force them to choose a key k blocks prior to building on the chain. The reason this helps is because the puzzle that they're going to need to solve, k blocks from when they register, is unpredictable. And so there's no way then that they can choose their public key in such a way that will allow them any preferential treatment in terms of extending the chain. In order to handle this attack I mentioned earlier, where malicious players try to fork the chain way back in the past, we have a way of handling such forks if they occur. So if a fork appears, and like in this picture here, and both divergent chains, both sides of the fork, have greater than or equal to k blocks, where k is another parameter here. Sorry, k is the parameter I mentioned on the previous slide. Then the rule in the system is that the side of the fork that generated those k blocks first is considered better, and that's the one that the honest party should adopt. So basically, if you look here, and assume that that represents k blocks, then what we'll do is we'll just compare the round numbers in which each of these k blocks were created. And if the green one were created before the red, then that would be the preferential chain. And if the red one were created first, then the bottom chain would be the preferential chain in that case. I think you have a question. Yeah? And moreover, if one or both of those chains has fewer than k blocks, then you just take the longer one, kind of as usual. So our protocol has a number of advantages. It is a permissionless system. Anybody can join at any time. We don't require any central authority to allow people in. It's a proof-of-stake protocol, which means it's very energy efficient. It's very scalable. Okay? It scales. We've run experiments on 10,000 plus nodes, and the protocol performs very well. We have the secure joining protocol, and we also, as I mentioned earlier, can claim adaptive security, again, meaning that even if an attacker is able to corrupt parties during the course of the protocol execution, the protocol still remains secure. And I want to highlight in particular, actually, that from the outside looking in, if you're looking at the system evolving, an attacker is not able to predict who the next block producer is going to be. So if you think about it, right, the state of the system, when you have a particular context, as I said earlier, everybody's going to be computing a hash on that context and the current set of transactions, and then their public key and the unique signature that they can produce on the prior two fields. So from that point of view, the person or the miner who's going to be extending the chain is fixed at that point in time. And you might be concerned, right, that gives an attacker the ability to go ahead and corrupt that person immediately before they extend the chain. But the point is that the attacker is not able to predict which party is going to extend the chain because of the properties of the signature scheme, right? The attacker is not able to compute the signature of any of the honest parties without knowing their secret key. And so even though from the point of view of the system as a whole, it's already fully determined who's going to extend the next block, the attacker doesn't know who it is, and so is not able to go ahead and corrupt them and skew things in their favor. So I'll pause here for a minute and see if there are any questions before I go on to the next topic of the talk. Question?
How about asynchronous network? Asynchronous.
An asynchronous
you have
network?
run the building the entire chain of things.
Sorry?
It seems you build the concept of run within the chain.
Well, first of all, I want to point out, you're talking about asynchronous communication.
Asynchronous the network.
Right. So even existing, actually almost all existing protocols that I'm aware of do require some kind of a synchrony assumption in the network, in the sense that, and actually this will come up when I talk about the next in the next part of the talk. They assume in particular that miners are able, or a sufficient fraction of miners are able to learn about the current set of transactions before the next block is being produced. And that's why it's actually important in Bitcoin that there's a 10-minute interval for block production, because 10 minutes is enough time for the current set of blocks to propagate in the network and make sure basically that everybody's in agreement on what the longest chain is and knows what they're trying to build on. So I'm not aware really of any blockchain protocol that doesn't require some form of synchrony assumption of that sort. So we have similar assumptions in it. And actually, well, I don't want to say in practice or not, but I guess in practice, if you look at what's occurs in Bitcoin, the network for the most part is synchronous, in the sense that messages are delivered in time much shorter than 10 minutes, and therefore the security holds. Other questions? Oh yes.
You require some registration of key with before certain time. Does that require you to trust someone? It's another assumption.
So right. So you're asking about registration, and so when a party registers their key, we don't we don't care about how they choose their key. And we don't need any central authority to admit them to the system. Maybe what you're asking is about how other people in the network learn what their key is, what their public key is.
No, do you have to trust the entity that?
No, you don't have to trust the person registering. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the assumption is that their key will be diffused through the network so that everyone learns about it, but you don't have to trust how they chose their key or anything about them. Is that a fair statement, Ron Chang? You had a question on that?
So what is the purpose of using the signature to the hash? Is it for finding the identity of the signer or just for?
Well, it's for everything, right? So the point of the signature in the hash is, first of all, we need a mechanism to basically selectively choose one person to extend the chain. So you need to put something there that's going to change depending on the miner. We use a unique signature so that each miner can only put one thing there and they can't change it. And then the signature, the property is that people can verify that it's a correct signature. Otherwise, you can put whatever you wanted there. So you basically, there are several different properties that all come into play, and they're all kind of essential for security of the system. So in the next part of the talk, what I wanted to look at is a scheme we call Backpacker. This is a new network paradigm for high-performance blockchains. And I want to motivate this a little bit by looking at an inherent security performance trade-off, actually related to this question you just asked me. So if you think about even Nakamoto consensus or an OR protocol, there are these two fundamental parameters of the system that are very important, both for security as well as for performance. And what those are is, first of all, the amount of time it takes for the miners in the system to learn about the current state of the system. That is, to both learn about the current set of transactions, but more importantly, to learn about the what block is, or to learn about the longest chain, essentially. Okay? And because everybody in the system is supposed to be working on the longest chain, and the minute I find a block and extend the chain, now that becomes the longest chain. Everybody else should learn about that before they start mining on the next block. So that's one parameter, right? The diffusion time for people in the network to learn about the longest chain. And then the other parameter is the block interval, right? How often are new blocks produced? And what I said a moment ago in response to the question is that the block interval in Bitcoin is fixed to about 10 minutes. So blocks are being produced, the chain is being extended every 10 minutes. And the network propagation time, right, the time for people in the network to learn about the current state of the system, you can do experiments and find out what it is, but let's say it's approximately 10 seconds or so, or under 10 seconds. And so that's a very big difference between the 10 seconds it takes for things to propagate and the 10 minutes for the next block to be created, which is good and which is necessary actually for security to hold. Now on the flip side, you can see that the longer the block interval time, the longer the latency is going to be, right? Because a transaction is not going to be committed at least until the next block is produced containing that transaction and added to the chain. So the lower bound on the on the confirmation time for a transaction is the block creation time. In fact, it's much greater than that, because if you really want to trust that a transaction is not going to be reversed, you may actually want to wait several blocks until the transaction is several blocks deep before considering it fixed. And furthermore, the throughput, right, will depend on how large the blocks are, which will in turn influence how many transactions a particular block can contain. So, for example, one thing you might try to do is you might try to increase the block size, right? Pack more transactions in a block and thereby increase the throughput. But if you do that, then there's going to be it's going to take a longer time for those blocks to propagate through the network, right? If I double the amount of transactions I'm putting in a block, then I'm doubling the amount of communication needed to send that block through the network, and then roughly speaking, I'm going to double the amount of time it takes for that block to be propagated throughout the network. And moreover, if I try to play with the block interval and make it shorter, then I'm going to get more forks because fewer people are going to be aware of the longest chain at any point in time, and therefore I'm going to get worse security. So you have this fundamental trade-off between the security and performance, right? If you try to increase performance, you might decrease security. And in general, there's a lot of challenges in trying to pick the best parameters, right? What we'd like to do is, say, fix the security goal as resilience to 51% of the network, and then try to optimize the throughput and latency. But it's not very clear how exactly to do that and what the best settings of the various parameters are, nor was it clear really what the fundamental limits are, right? Is there a lower bound, not dependent on any particular protocol, but some fundamental lower bound for all protocols as to what kind of throughput and latency can be achieved for some given security threshold? And this is the kind of question we look at in this work. And to examine this question, and in particular to try to find out what the fundamental limits are, we first take this viewpoint of blockchain as a peer-to-peer network. So the comparison is the following. So in blockchain, and this is in general, this is not tied to any particular protocol, but in a blockchain system, you have a block producer trying to broadcast their block throughout the network. You're interested in, as I said earlier, the throughput, right, the number of blocks being committed per second, and also the block propagation time, the time for any particular block to be communicated to the rest of the network, or a majority of the network. And in a peer-to-peer content distribution network, the block producer is playing the role of a source node, trying to publish some file or some data that they want to replicate throughout the system. And there also, people have been studying the throughput and distribution time for particular content distribution schemes. And in analyzing the performance and the fundamental limits of performance of those schemes, they've looked at a setting where you have this network of nodes, and each node I has some upload bandwidth UI and download bandwidth DI. And a nice result by Kumar and Ross from 2006 actually characterizes the optimal throughput in such a system. And what they show actually is that the throughput in the system is bounded by a minimum of these three quantities, where D minimum is the minimum download bandwidth in the system. US is the source upload bandwidth, so obviously if the source has low bandwidth, they can only upload the file at a particular rate. And assuming that's not the limiting factor, the interesting one is this average upload bandwidth in the systems, right? This is just the average upload bandwidth taken over all the nodes in the network. And this source bottleneck can be potentially solved with parallelism. And so what turns out to be the major bottleneck is this average upload bandwidth of the nodes in the system. And as far as the latency goes, there's also a natural network limit on propagation time. This is not too hard to see. So as I said earlier, for the security of any blockchain, you need the block propagation time to be much less than the block interval. But the block propagation time, it's not too hard to see, is lower bounded by the maximum latency of the shortest paths in the system. Right? So if you want everybody in the network to learn about a particular piece of data being transmitted by the source, then what you can do is, right, you can just look at, for every node J, look at the shortest path from the source to J, and then take the maximum over all those shortest paths. And that's going to give you a lower bound on the time it takes for that data to propagate to every node in the network. And that can be achieved, of course, when blocks travel along the shortest paths. But also it requires the block size to be small, right? If the block size is large, then the latency on any particular link or over any particular path is not going to be the limiting factor. It'll be then the bandwidth of that path. But if the block size is small, then the latency is going to dominate rather than the bandwidth, and you can achieve actually this lower bound and get the block propagation time to be as low as what's possible. So there have been various proposals in the context of blockchain and Bitcoin in particular for trying to improve performance, trying to improve the throughput and the latency. I'll just say this briefly, and I won't really have time to discuss them in detail. There's Bitcoin Compact, there's the Bitcoin NG protocol. People have also looked at modifying the Nakamoto consensus protocol, and rather than looking only at the longest chain, actually doing a DAG-based protocol where you can connect blocks to multiple previous blocks and potentially incorporate many of those into the current state of the system. And then, of course, there are other ideas that are kind of orthogonal to these, things like off-chain transactions to basically reduce the amount of data you need to put on the chain and sharding. And in general, it's not clear what's the best approach. Each of these things I mentioned on the previous slide have their own set of advantages and disadvantages. And in fact, in some cases, different proposals that were on the previous slide can be used together. Right? So for example, this idea of off-chain transactions is compatible really with any blockchain. And so if you have some idea for improving throughput on a blockchain at the protocol level, you can then couple that also with the idea of off-chain transactions in order to improve the overall performance further. Another problem with all of these is that it's very difficult, again, to find the right set of parameters to optimize throughput and latency while maintaining a given level of security. And so to address this, we wrote a blockchain simulator that allows us to handle simulations of very large blockchains while still being relatively lightweight. So we can scale to simulations incorporating about 20,000 nodes, we can vary parameters in the system and look at all different kinds of performance metrics for these different protocols under variations in topology, variations in the latency, variations in the bandwidth between different nodes in the system. We can then do powerful statistical analysis over protocols that are run. We can look at things like the throughput, the block propagation time, confirmation time, etc. And the simulator is event-driven and uses a modular design, and therefore it should be useful for people, for other researchers, to allow them to rapidly prototype new protocols that they develop. And when we ran existing proposals, some of which I mentioned on the previous slide, to compare and see how they perform in our simulation, we found actually that, interestingly, right, if you look at here the throughput, and we look at the performance here just shown on the slide of the original Bitcoin protocol, the Bitcoin Compact proposal for Bitcoin, the Bitcoin NG protocol, Ethereum, and Conflux, we see actually that, a little bit surprising to us, Bitcoin Compact performs the best in terms of both the throughput as well as the block propagation time, which will directly impact the overall latency. But nevertheless, if you look at the bandwidth utilization, which is basically taking into account what fraction of the bandwidth is being used to communicate actual transactions versus bandwidth that's being used for other protocol messages and things like that, even for the best of them, even for Bitcoin Compact, the utilization is very low. So the way to think about this is that you have some bandwidth overall in the system, some average bandwidth between nodes, let's say, and when you run the Bitcoin Compact protocol, roughly only 4% of the bandwidth is being utilized for the purposes of disseminating transactions for the blockchain. And we found that the main culprit and the reason that the bandwidth utilization was so low is, in fact, the transaction broadcasting, right? The huge overhead that the nodes need in order to gossip a transaction across the entire network. Part of that is because of the way that the Bitcoin protocol works. So the way it currently works is that every time a node wants to transmit a transaction to another node, 3 messages are sent back and forth between those nodes, like an invite, request, get message. And this is happening with each of the node's neighbors as well. So you have this peer-to-peer network that defines the Bitcoin network. Each node in the network is connected on average to 32 other nodes, and it's constantly trying to send back and forth new transactions that it learns about and make sure that all of its neighbors are also aware of that transaction. And if the average degree is kept at 32, this will in fact cap the maximum possible bandwidth utilization at only 10%. So the main idea with Backpacker is to separate out consensus into essentially 2 phases. And if you think about the overall goal of a consensus protocol, of a blockchain protocol, is to allow all nodes to agree on a given order of various transactions in the system. So we separate that out into 2 phases, where one phase is to agree on a set of transactions, and only afterward do we allow the nodes then to reach agreement on the ordering of those transactions. Right? So we first might allow them to learn what the next 100 transactions are, and then at some point later in time to agree on the ordering of those 100 transactions. So just at a high level, let me summarize the way our scheme works. What we do is we introduce a new entity into the system, or new entities, called packers. So these packers, their job is going to be to receive transactions from users, and then every so often to create what we call pseudo-blocks that are going to contain signed sets of transactions. We ensure that these packers are incentivized to participate. We do have an incentive mechanism that we design as part of this. I'm not going to mention it just for lack of time in this talk. You can ask about it if you're interested. And the idea then is that these packers, right, are going to be constantly packing transactions into these pseudo-blocks and then broadcasting these pseudo-blocks to other miners and other packers. And this is going to, in fact, have a huge impact on performance, because now what the nodes are going to be doing is sending this invite, request, get sequence of messages per pseudo-block rather than per transaction. Right? So if you imagine that you pack 1,000 transactions into a pseudoblock, this will effectively almost reduce the overhead by about a factor of 1,000. We'll have the miners solve puzzles on blocks as before. This is assuming that the underlying blockchain protocol is a Bitcoin-like protocol or using Nakamoto consensus. But the blocks now are going to include pseudo-blocks rather than transactions. And after solving a puzzle, what the miner is going to do is they're going to broadcast what we call a meta block rather than the block itself. So the meta block will just identify which pseudo-blocks are included in the block, right, and their ordering. And importantly, it doesn't have to include the transactions themselves, because the assumption is that the pseudo-blocks and hence the transactions inside them have already been propagated. So this comes back to what I said earlier about separating out the agreement on the next bunch of transactions and then determining the ordering on those transactions. So the next set of transactions will be effectively obtained by having these pseudo-blocks be disseminated throughout the network. And it's only upon solving a puzzle and broadcasting that meta block that the ordering among those pseudo-blocks becomes defined. So let's see, I think I might be running a little short on time. Let me skip a little bit of this. Yeah, let me mention this. This is actually something important. So one optimization that we introduced is called soft spatial sharding. And the goal here is to basically avoid having too many, having a transaction being packed in too many pseudo-blocks, right? What you'd like to do if you want to optimize the throughput of the system is ideally to have each transaction appear in only one pseudo-block, and then as long as everyone finds out about every pseudo-block, then everybody finds out about every transaction. And so to achieve that, what we do is we come up with a mechanism whereby packers are going to prioritize what we call closer transactions. So the distance of a particular packer to a transaction is defined by computing a hash over the packer's public key and that given transaction. We can let tau I then denote the rank of that packer relative to all other packers. And then what we'll do is we'll have all the we'll have a particular packer I at any given point in time try to pack any transactions that it hasn't packed already into a pseudo-block as long as this condition holds. So basically what this is saying is that at a given moment in time, well, let's say at time 0 when it first learns about a transaction, only the closest packer will try to put that transaction into its pseudo-block. And then if it hasn't observed the pseudo-block containing that transaction after some period of time, well then what we'll do, if you look at the animation, it'll then assign that transaction to the next closest or the third closest, etc., until eventually it sees that transaction has been incorporated into some pseudo-block. And I should mention actually this also achieves resilience in case one of the packers is offline. So for example, if this closest packer to that transaction were not active or were malicious or whatever, then this would ensure that after some period of time, the second closest packer would try to pack the transaction and so it would still get incorporated. I'm going to skip this again for lack of time. This is just a picture corresponding to what I talked about earlier. One key point, though, I want to mention is that we introduced what we call this intentional packing delay to ensure that when a miner is mining this block and incorporating pseudo-blocks into that block, it only incorporates what we call delta old pseudo-blocks, meaning pseudo-blocks that it learned about, at least delta units of time ago. And the reason for that is to make sure that that the block should only contain pseudo-blocks that other people already know about. Right? If I just this second learned a pseudo-block and then put it in a block, it may not have had time for everybody else to learn about that pseudo-block, and therefore when I broadcast that meta-block, it would do no good for anybody because they would need to learn about the transaction, they would need to learn about the pseudo-block. And I mentioned that we can enforce this using a verifiable delay function, but if we assume miners are behaving honestly or some fraction are behaving honestly, it may not be necessary. So I just want to highlight the core reasons for the improvement in performance. We get increased bandwidth efficiency because we have multiple sources transmitting in parallel, and more importantly, we've reduced this broadcast overhead by about a factor of 1,000 by virtue of packing about 1,000 transactions into a pseudoblock. And as I'll show in a couple of slides, this actually allows us to reach the physical limit imposed by the network. We improve latency because these small meta blocks are being propagated when a miner succeeds in mining the next block, rather than having to propagate the full block. So this is going to mean that now new blocks that are mined can be propagated through the network much more quickly, and thereby that's going to have an overall generate an overall improvement in the latency. So I won't go through the math here. I'll just say quickly that we have a way of optimizing the rate on links between individual nodes here by using some queue optimization theory. But the upshot that I want to highlight is that we can prove actually that the throughput in our system is within a constant factor of the network limit. So remember earlier I gave a bound on the optimal throughput that can be achieved in any network, and we're able actually to approach that limit to within a constant factor. And similarly, I'll just highlight the punchline at the bottom, is that we can show that the latency we achieve is also within a constant factor of the optimal latency that can be achieved in that network. And this is because we ensure that the meta blocks are traveling along shortest paths, and they're small enough so that the latency is the bound rather than the bandwidth. So I haven't talked yet about the effect on security of introducing these new nodes, these packers, into the system. I'll just say quickly here that it's not too hard to see, actually, that the consistency of the underlying blockchain, whatever blockchain you're using, is going to be unaffected even if all the packers in the system are malicious. Right? So the consistency guarantees provided by the blockchain are basically independent of what's going on at the packer level. Liveness, though, is a potential concern. And in particular, if all the packers go offline, then it just means that no new transactions are going to be inserted into the system. Nevertheless, that's kind of the worst case, right? So as long as one packer is honest, eventually every block will get propagated and will eventually be incorporated. So all we need is at least one of the packers is honest. And in fact, we can even tolerate all malicious packers by simply having the block producers act as temporary packers if they see that all the packers are down. Skip this for lack of time. So I want to just report briefly on some experiments and benchmarks here. Again, I'll go quickly for lack of time. I think this table is the main thing. So if you look at, again, the throughput, block propagation time, and then the effective bandwidth utilization of these different proposals. So what we find actually is a significant improvement in the throughput when using our backpacker approach. And similarly, a significant reduction in the block propagation time as compared to this prior work. And we're able to achieve a bandwidth utilization of about 72%, which is, you can see, much, much higher than even the best previous scheme was able to achieve. These are some other numbers illustrating the same point, but now for a high bandwidth mode, where we increase the average node bandwidth by about an order of magnitude, showing really that we're able to scale with increased bandwidth. And in that case, increase both the transaction time and slightly decrease the block propagation time. Again, I'm going to go through these quickly because we're almost out of time. I just want to point out that we have good confirmation times as well. We can achieve confirmation times in about 45 seconds. And we've actually implemented a real-world benchmark with about 20,000 nodes. I didn't realize it was an animated slide like that. Cool. Which is able to sustain a transaction rate of about 3,000 to 5,000 transactions per second. So just to summarize, we've been able to improve on prior work in the blockchain space along 3 axes. We get better sustainability by virtue of using a proof-of-stake protocol rather than a proof-of-work protocol. We get improved scalability through this backpackers approach that I talked about, which is the first decentralized and secure layer 0 design for improving blockchain performance, and allows us to achieve near optimal throughput and latency. And we also get improved security by virtue of, again, moving to a proof-of-stake system achieving lower fork rates because of the better propagation time, and also because we achieve better decentralization. And we have a public testnet available as well that you're welcome to take a look at. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be very happy to take any questions that you might have.
Can I view those packers are running a special kind of BFT, then feed it to the lower part of the public consensus POS? And that BFT, as you require, have weak security goals. It's not like a normal BFT. Very, very weak.
Yeah, you can view it that way. So the question was whether you can view the packers as implementing a BFT algorithm. So you can try to view it that way, but I think, like you said, the important point is the last thing you said, that it's not achieving the traditional goals of a BFT. In particular, you may not have agreement, right? So you may not even get the security of a BFT protocol, but it doesn't matter because you're getting the agreement from the underlying blockchain protocol. So maybe you could define some notion of, semi-agreement or something, and then prove that it achieves that. So you can view it like that conceptually, but it's not running a full-fledged BFT because it's not achieving in particular a guaranteed agreement among the packets.
So, yeah, I kind of a follow-up question to his question regarding the security assumptions for the packers. So how many packers do you have in your experimental settings?
Yeah, so actually that's a good, I don't know the answer. Do you know how many packers were in the experimental setup?
30? So with that, because all the miners will receive or request the block information through the packers, that's 30 packers. Would that actually introduce people or the attackers to just attack the packers layer, or?
Oh, you thinking by doing a denial of service?
Yeah, something like that.
So that's actually very interesting. I mean, so first of all, let me point out that you could have the same denial of service attack on existing blockchains. Right?
Exactly.
If I took you and I just flooded you with garbage, right? If I wanted to attack a particular miner in the system, you'd have the same problem. So I don't think that this problem is created by the packer approach.
Exactly.
You're asking maybe whether it makes it worse. I mean, it's a good question. I haven't thought about it a lot, actually.
Okay.
I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about it? I mean, again, I don't think it makes it any worse than what's in existing systems, is what I would say.
Maybe it's easier for the country to block the entire network, just to block the
No, are you saying if the packers were located in one physical region? So I think the packers would need to be distributed as well. I mean, if the packers are all cut off from the rest of the network, that would be bad. So you'd want the packers to be distributed as well, or at least to be available as well.
So the packers are randomly selected.
So they're selected from the miners' sets per round or fixed?
It depends on the design.
Oh, okay.
So you can say 1 day or 0 hours.
I see.
Yeah, so there are different models actually, which
Exactly.
is when we're being a little cagey. I mean, you could imagine a provisioned set of packers being provided by a company for a service.
I see.
Or you could imagine having them selected randomly, or you could imagine hybrid models as well.
Okay.
And we can also increase the size of the packets.
Yeah. Of course.
So through this rational programmatic approach, you can incentivize people to participate, to play the role of the packets.
Yes?
So in the state system, in order to select a miner, then there's a the hash value is smaller than the parameter t. Then how do you set the parameter t, and what if multiple miners are selected?
Right, so the question is, how do you set the parameter t in the proof of stake system? And then what happens if multiple is selected? So it's very similar actually to what goes on in Bitcoin. So first of all, you want to set the parameter t such that in expectation, only one miner is extending the chain. So that means that t will have to be dependent on the total stake in the system at any given point in time to ensure that that happens. The other question is what happens if, every once in a while, 2 or more people extend the chain at the same time. And that again will be similar to Bitcoin. You'll have a temporary fork that will then get resolved.
I just noticed that you choose the 2,4-DX strategy, right? In the proof of stake consensus protocol. So I'm just curious about, is that the best strategy, or have you tried anything else?
So no, so it's not. Okay, when you say best, so it's not the best because if you did the infinity strategy, that would be better. But maybe you're asking, so it's basically an optimization between the complexity of the protocol and the security that you can achieve. So maybe what you're asking is like for a given complexity, is that the best security?
Right. So what's the reason for choosing 2 and 4 for time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason, Hansheng can add, but I think the reason is basically to get something close to 50%, and that gave a reasonable trade-off between, like I said, the 57% threshold with a not too bad increase in the work of the honest parties. Do you want to say further anything about that?
So basically what John said, it's a trade-off between the complexity of design and the security of Yeah, that's the one that we choose.
Great, well, thank you again. I hope many of you will come out to the tutorials on Thursday and Friday. And otherwise, again, I'll thank you again for paying attention.